Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Andre and I'm your bookworm, and today we don't have a book review because it's the start of the month. So we have actually a November wrap-up slash predictive TBR for December. For the ones that don't know what this video is about, pretty much I'm gonna go through the books that I read in the previous month, just say briefly what I thought of it, the score that I gave compared with Goodreads, and then after that I'll just tell you what are the books that I predict that I'll be reading in December. But of course this all can change depending on my mood, depending on how much time I have to read, because December is always busy with Christmas, New Year's, and everything in between. So let's see how it goes. It's a bit hot here in Melbourne, so just stand with me sweating a bit in this room. But so let's go first with what is the overall view for November. This month was definitely better than the last one. In October, I started really good at the start of the month, and then around the halfway part, I just had a slump and I didn't read much at all. So this month in November was much better. I didn't read that much. In the end, I read 4 books, 3 manga volumes, and 2 short stories. And it might not sound that much compared with October, but the fact is that the books I read, some of them were quite chunky, so in the end I read a lot of pages, so that's pretty much what I aim to achieve, is just try to read a bit more than the previous month. So for November, I read around 3,000 pages, and like I said, it was a bit better than October, and October was a little bit better than September, so as long as we're in this upwards trajectory, that's what we want. But the best part of it is that the scores that I gave in November were actually much better than the scores in October, because the scores ranged from 4.2 to 5, so really good scores for the books that I read. But first, let's start with the books that I'm currently reading, get them out of the way so that we can talk about the books I've read. If you've been seeing the videos I released recently, you know that I've been advancing a lot in Wheel of Time, and by now I've actually finished Wheel of Time, the whole series. And so my buddy read has finished, and that was one of the things I mentioned in the previous video, was what am I going to read once I finish Wheel of Time? Well, after some discussion with the people that I'm doing my buddy read with, we've ended up deciding on reading another famous fantasy series. This one you'll probably know, I have a hint you will, and that series is A Song of Ice and Fire. So yes, I'm reading the first book, which is called A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. And I've read this series before, of course. It's a reread, but it's also my first reread of this series. I've never reread it. I just read it as the books were coming out, especially the last 2. So it'll be fun to read this series again, especially after the TV show and with the House of the Dragon coming out as well concurrently. So let's see how it goes. And it's also fun because a lot of the things that I read I had forgotten about, and so it's fun to just reread these parts and also compare it with the TV show and how they changed things. So yeah, this is the book I forgot to show, but I mean, who doesn't know what Game of Thrones is? My other current reread is still the same one on my ebook, which is Lord of the Mysteries. It's a web novel written by Cuttlefish that loves diving. I'm approaching the end. I'm about 85%, so very close to the end. I think I'll be able to finish in December. It's been a fun and learning experience. This is my first web novel. It was weird at the start, but as I kept going, it started being more fun. And I think at the part that I am, the plot has advanced a lot and it has become quite engaging. Hopefully, the first volume ends up in a high, and that will determine if I read the second one anytime soon or not. My third ongoing read is Aurora by Kim Stanley Robinson. This was actually the book I had predicted I would read last in November, so I kinda guessed right on my predictions. And at time of recording, I'm almost done with this. I have around 50 pages left, so I should actually finish this before the month ends, because I'm recording this a couple of days before December starts, so I've actually fulfilled all my predictions. This is a hard sci-fi book. It's full on with the science, very hard. Sometimes it can be quite difficult to read, but I still enjoyed it. I think it touches some topics that are quite relevant, but also very interesting to divulge in and to think about. But at the same time, I was expecting it to go in a different direction than the one it went. So it's a bit mixed so far, but I'm still keen to know what the last 50 pages hold and figure out if it ends in a big climax or not. Anyways, a book review will come out for it once I finish it, so stay aware of it, stay on, and you'll see it. Okay, now that my ongoing reads are done, let's focus on the books that I finished in November. Let's start, of course, with Wheel of Time, because the book that I finished in that series was the last one, A Memory of Light, which was written by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. And what can I say in a short period about this book? Just amazing. It was everything that I was hoping for, especially on a reread. I knew what was going to happen. I was emotional reading it. This book grabbed me by the neck in less than 100 pages and it wouldn't let go till the right end. And yes, it was very fulfilling to read this after reading 14 books in the series and seeing how the characters develop, all the plots end up in this one climatic battle. So very, very fun. Anyways, details will come soon once I do a full review for this book. But for now, regarding scores, I'll say that on Goodreads, this book has a score of 4.57 out of 5, which is extremely high and just shows how good the end of this series is. And for me, the score that I gave was a 5 out of 5. So I couldn't give any less. This is perfect. My favorite series. So yeah, I'm a bit biased, but what can I say? The next book that I finished was The Last House on Needless Street by Catriona Ward. And actually, I finished this one before A Memory of Light, but I thought that A Memory of Light needed to be spoken about first. This is a horror book. I read it because Halloween was coming and I had this horror book to read recommended by a friend, so I decided to give it a try. And in the last video, I was still reading this book and I mentioned that it was fun, but it was a bit predictable towards the end. It wasn't predictable in the way that it hurts it. It was just like, oh, I could see that coming. It makes sense. But the fact is, I still had, I don't know how many pages, I'm gonna say 50 around that. And those 50 pages turned everything around. There were more plot twists. I was not expecting any of them, and it reframed the whole story completely. It definitely made my enjoyment of the book higher because of it. And at the same time, I enjoyed it because it was a deviation from the usual sci-fi and fantasy that I'm used to read. On Goodreads, this book has a score of 3.84. I don't know if that's high or not for horror books on Goodreads because I don't read that many horror books. But for me, I gave it a score of 4.2 out of 5. So as you can see, it might be the lowest score I gave this month, but still, I think it's a really fun, fun in a very macabre way, but still, it's a good read to do while on Halloween. There were just a couple of things that I didn't really enjoy, but that I'll mention in the actual review of this book, which should come eventually. After that, I finished the 2 Wheel of Time short stories that exist, which are called River of Souls, and not Soul of Rivers like I mentioned in the previous video, and A Fire Within the Waves. These were written by Brandon Sanderson and Robert Jordan, with notes of Robert Jordan, I must say. And these are very, very short. They are technically non-canon for the Wheel of Time series, so you don't need to read them. But I just read them because, anything Wheel of Time, I would just read it because I really love the world. But in this mini review, I'll just clump them together and say that I can see why they weren't included. They were quite sidelined in terms of the last book and why they would just take attention from the main part of the book. And so they weren't included. I can see that. Still, I found it interesting, and it's a different perspective of seeing how things could have turned out. On Goodreads, these 2 short stories have scores of 3.76 and 3.92 respectively. However, I give it a score of 4 for both because I think they're still strong. The first one, Soul of Rivers, is really, really short, so you can't really evaluate much about it, but still I think it was strong enough to deserve a 4. I probably won't do a whole review video about these, but just know that these were the scores. I think that for the hard fans, I recommend them to read it, and if you are content with just having the series ended in that A Memory of Light, then you can do that as well. Then after that, I finally jumped into Discworld by Terry Pratchett. I know, after promising for ages that I was going to read another Terry Pratchett book, I finally grabbed one and read it, and this is Sorcery, which I thought it belonged to the Witches series for some reason, but it actually doesn't. It's the 3rd book in the Rincewind series. This was a lovely read. I think the more I read about Rincewind, the more I like him as a character, and I think that's one of the greatest powers of Terry Pratchett, is make you fall in love with all these characters that are so charismatic. This might not be the best Discworld book, but I think it's still a very strong entry into the world. I wouldn't recommend it for newbies to read this book as an entry point into Discworld, but I think it's a good book to enter once you've read a few of them. On Goodreads, this book has a score of 3.91 out of 5, which a bit low for Terry Pratchett, but at the same time, again, it's not one of his strongest books. But still, for me, I give it a score of 4.2 out of 5. So a bit higher, but yeah, not that amazing as well. And the last book I finished in the month of November was The Autumn Republic by Brian McClellan. This I was also promising to read for a while. This is the third book of the Powder Mage trilogy. I've read and reviewed the first two books here on the channel. You can check them out through the thumbnails or the cards. And what can I say about this? I think it's a delightful piece of flintlock fantasy with mixing a really well-written military fantasy, and it has enough mystery if you also like that detective type of mystery, so a good mix of a lot of good things. And I think this last book does not disappoint. There were a couple of things, bits here and there that I didn't really enjoy, but overall the piece was good for a final book. I was expecting a bigger showdown towards the end, a big climax, which wasn't fully delivered, but nonetheless it was enjoyable, and I'm definitely reading more books by Brian McClellan because it got me curious about it. On Goodreads, this book has a score of 4.36 out of 5, and my score was a 4.4 out of 5, so they're very, very close to each other, and so you can see that my opinion is pretty much equal to the average population on Goodreads. And just like for the other books, I shall have a full review for this book coming out eventually once I have enough time, so keep an eye on that. As for the mangas, I'm still on One Piece. I read the volumes 49 to 51, and this is pretty much the ending of Thriller Bark, and the start of the Sabaody arc. Shabodi, which means we had very epic moments in the end of the volume 49, and we're about to have even more epic and sad moments in the volumes to come. Personally, the volume 50 was my favorite of the three because it had a moment with Zoro that I thought was very impactful, and the other two volumes, although they still had some important things, I thought they were also covered with a lot of non-important stuff that kind of detracted from the main points. Anyways, the scores on these volumes on Goodreads are 4.43, 4.52, and 4.56, so increasing as they go, whereas my scores were 4.4, 5, and 4.4. So overall, for volume 49, my opinion kinda aligns with Goodreads, but for the other ones, it's a bit different. Anyways, I'm very keen to read the rest because it will be epic and quite emotional. And those were the books/mangas that I finished in the month of November. Now let's jump into what I'm predicting to read in December. And let's start with the Game of Thrones. If I finish that book, which it's very likely that I won't, so I'll just say that, but in case I do, I'll read the second book of the Song of Ice and Fire series, which is A Clash of Kings. But then again, my battery read always starts a bit slow, so I don't think I'll be finishing this book in December. However, I do think I will finish Lord of the Mysteries in December, and if that is the case, then I shall be jumping into Ryan Cahill's books, reading his second short story, which is called The Exile. And this is set between the second and the third main books of the series, if I'm not mistaken, and the series is The Bound and the Broken, if I'm not mistaken. I always confuse The Bound and the Broken with The Faithful and the Fallen, but Faithful and the Fallen is coming after. And if this short story is capable of sparking my interest and my appetite for more Ryan Cahill, then I'll jump into the third book. Otherwise, not really sure what I'll read. And once I finish Aurora by Kim Stanley Robinson, what I'll jump into is the Faithful and the Fallen series written by John Gwynne, and I'll be reading the third book, which is Ruin. This is the third book of a tetralogy, so 4 books. I'm on the second half of it. It's an epic fantasy series with a lot of Nordic mythology inspiration or Viking inspiration. The first book I thought was very good, especially the character work on it, whereas the second book, it was okay, not as good as the first one, but I have hopes that the third one would increase its quality again, because I think the character arcs that we went through the second book will be done, and so we can start increasing the momentum and the tension amongst everything for the epic showdown that will be the fourth book. Once I finish that epic one, I shall be reading a lighter book, and that will be another Terry Pratchett book, which is Weird Sisters. And I'm gonna do this simply because now that I had a bit of Discworld in my mouth, I'm gonna have it more because I just want to have some fun, and it's the end of the year, so I want to read lighter things, especially with Christmas and New Year's around. And also it's a short book, so I hope I'll be able to read it faster. And what about this book? This is the 6th book of the Discworld, if I'm not mistaken. It is the second one of the Witches series, so this time I'm not mistaken. Witches series, which I love the first one, so I'm really keen to read this one, and I hope that this one is just as good as the first one, pretty much. Let's hope there aren't disappointments, because I'm expecting a lot of books, so let's see. After that, I'm gonna jump into science fiction, and for that I'm gonna read Artemis by Andy Weir. This is not any part of any series, it's just a standalone book, pretty much like all the other books that Andy Weir wrote, such as The Martian and Project Hail Mary, which I've read both. I enjoyed both. I think Project Hail Mary is better than The Martian, but the thing is, I've heard that Artemis is the weakest of the three, so let's see if I think the same. Hopefully not. Hopefully I think that Artemis is just as good. And because I'm feeling courageous and I'm hoping that I'm able to read all these books, I'm gonna put on the TBR as well, Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. I don't really like this cover. I prefer the other cover that has the orcs or whatever they are in serving the lattes and everything. I think that has a lot of good feels in the cover, so I wish they had that. But anyways, this is a cozy fantasy book. It was very famous last year, and since then I've been curious to read it. I've been waiting a while so that the hype would pass, because I don't know, I don't really enjoy reading books when there's the hype, because then there's a lot of expectations going around. But now that everything has calmed down, I'm gonna read it. Hopefully it's a cozy, really fun fantasy book to read, especially towards the end of the year, like I said. And the thing is, if I don't read this book by the end of the year, then I'll just start reading it at the start of next year. So it's just as good as a moment to read a cozy fantasy book. And of course, amongst all of these, I'm gonna read more manga, more One Piece, and hopefully, I always say this, but hopefully I'll be able to read another 3 or 4 volumes, let's say. I don't know if that is enough to finish the Sabaody arc, because I remember it's being quite short, but let's see how it goes. And that is pretty much it. All the books I read, all the books I'm gonna read in the next month. Now, I wanna know about you. What are your favorite books of November? What is the books that you're planning to read at the end of the year? Comment down below. And if you're new, don't forget to subscribe, like the content, and I'll be seeing you on Thursdays and Sundays, okay? See you soon.